A 1963 United States Post Office Department bulletin introduced the Zone Improvement Plan, or zip code, as a national addressing standard. The document framed the new numbering system not as a convenience for residents, but as a logistical necessity for sorting mail within an increasingly mechanized postal network. Rising mail volume, suburban expansion, and the adoption of optical sorting equipment required addresses to be translated into machine-readable zones. In this institutional moment, geography was recast as a routing problem, and numbers became the preferred medium for organizing movement across a continental infrastructure. A postal sorting facility in Philadelphia during the early 1960s illustrates the operational pressures behind the system's adoption. Conveyor belts moved thousands of envelopes per hour, while clerks manually interpreted city names and neighborhood references that varied in spelling and format. The introduction of zip codes reduced interpretive labor by assigning each delivery area a numeric identity. In this environment, the authority of the postal system defined what constituted a valid location. Not a neighborhood name or local designation, but a standardized code compatible with machines and national routing maps. A regional postal map produced in 1963 divided the United States into 10 large zones, each anchored by a major mail processing center. The first digit of the zip code corresponded to one of these zones, transforming a diverse landscape into a hierarchical routing grid. The map did not reflect cultural regions or municipal boundaries. Instead, it visualized transportation efficiency. Institutional authority determined that proximity to sorting hubs, not local identity, would define the spatial logic of everyday addresses. A postal training manual distributed to clerks emphasized strict adherence to zip codes, even when local place names were widely recognized. The manual instructed workers to prioritize numeric codes over descriptive address elements to maintain sorting consistency. Through such directives, the Postal Service normalized the idea that a 5-digit code carried more operational meaning than community-based identifiers. Authority reshaped the definition of place by privileging standardized references over local knowledge. A suburban housing development brochure from the late 1960s prominently displayed its newly assigned zip code as part of its marketing materials. The inclusion of the code signaled compatibility with federal infrastructure and modern services. As suburban expansion accelerated, developers aligned their projects with postal standards to ensure efficient mail delivery, utility registration, and government record-keeping. Institutional classification began to influence how new communities define themselves, embedding zip codes into the identity of emerging neighborhoods. A municipal planning report from the 1970s used zip code boundaries to aggregate demographic data for federal funding applications. The report did not claim that zip codes represented natural communities. Rather, they were used because federal agencies required standardized geographic units for statistical reporting. This administrative use transformed a mail routing tool into a default framework for data collection. Institutional requirements, rather than geographic accuracy, determined which boundaries would structure social analysis. A federal health survey formed from the same decade requested respondents' zip codes as a primary location identifier. The form's design reflected the need for uniform data aggregation across states and counties. By substituting zip codes for more detailed geographic descriptors, federal agencies streamlined analysis. While reinforcing the code's authority as a spatial reference, the system's expansion into health, taxation, and census operations demonstrates how institutional adoption stabilized the code's meaning beyond its original postal function. A computer database schema from the 1980s defined zip code fields as fixed-length numeric entries, enabling automated validation and sorting. Early digital systems required standardized inputs, and zip codes provided a consistent format for location data. The constraints of software design reinforced the rigidity of the system as databases rejected addresses lacking valid codes. Institutional reliance on digital compatibility narrowed acceptable alternatives, embedding zip codes into the architecture of emerging information systems. A logistics company's routing software in the 1990s used zip code prefixes to optimize delivery schedules. Rather than relying on street-level geography, the software grouped shipments by the first 3 digits of the code, reflecting regional processing centers. This operational practice demonstrates path dependence. Once the postal grid became the foundation for routing, private logistics systems adopted the same structure to maintain compatibility. Early institutional decisions limited the viability of alternative geographic frameworks. A state taxation form issued in the early 2000s required zip codes to determine applicable local tax rates. While tax jurisdictions did not perfectly align with postal zones, the use of zip codes simplified administrative processing. The form acknowledged discrepancies but maintained the system for efficiency. Institutional inertia favored a standardized reference even when it introduced minor inaccuracies, illustrating how established frameworks persist. Despite imperfect alignment with underlying realities, a Geographic Information System (GIS) dataset, published by a federal agency, distinguished between zip codes and zip code tabulation areas, ZCTAs, noting that postal codes were designed for mail delivery rather than demographic analysis. Despite this clarification, CCTAs became widely used in research. Because they approximated zip code boundaries, the adaptation demonstrates how institutional systems evolve to accommodate existing standards, rather than replace them. Instead of abandoning zip codes, agencies created derivative frameworks to preserve compatibility. A rural address conversion initiative in the 2010s reassigned descriptive route-based addresses to standardized street addresses paired with zip codes. The program aimed to improve emergency response and service delivery. By integrating remote areas into the postal grid, the initiative extended institutional classification into regions previously defined by informal geographic markers. The expansion reinforced the zip code's role as a national spatial standard. A disaster response coordination report used zip codes to allocate resources following a hurricane. Relief agencies grouped affected populations by code to distribute supplies and track recovery metrics. Although disaster impact did not conform to postal boundaries, the use of zip codes enabled rapid coordination across multiple organizations. Procedural adherence to standardized units replaced precise geographic analysis, demonstrating how institutional frameworks prioritize interoperability over contextual accuracy. A commercial marketing database segmented consumers by zip code to target advertising campaigns. The segmentation relied on aggregated demographic profiles associated with codes, rather than individual behavior. Businesses adopted the postal grid as a proxy for socioeconomic patterns. Because it aligned with existing data infrastructure, institutional classification thus shaped market strategies, reinforcing the zip code as a stable unit of analysis across sectors. A public school district boundary map overlapped partially with zip code lines, but did not align perfectly. Despite this mismatch, parents often referenced zip codes when discussing school zones, because the code provided a familiar geographic shorthand. Institutional usage in mail, data, and services had normalized the code's authority, allowing it to function as a common reference even outside its intended scope. A federal grant application portal required applicants to enter zip codes to determine eligibility for regional funding programs. The portal's automated validation relied on the postal database, ensuring consistent classification across submissions. Applicants complied with the requirement, regardless of whether the code accurately represented their service area. Procedural adherence replaced localized interpretation, reinforcing standardized handling as the basis for participation in institutional processes. A historical comparison of European postal systems reveals that many countries adopted alphanumeric codes, reflecting municipal divisions rather than sorting hubs. In the United States, however, the numeric structure prioritized logistical efficiency over administrative boundaries. Alternative models such as county-based codes or municipal identifiers were considered, but did not persist because they conflicted with the Postal Service's centralized routing framework. Structural compatibility, not geographic fidelity, determined the system's survival. A proposal from the early 1970s suggested expanding zip codes to include neighborhood-level identifiers for urban planning. The proposal was not adopted, partly due to the complexity it would introduce into sorting equipment and databases. Institutional resistance to increased variability favored maintaining the existing 5-digit format. The decision illustrates how technological and administrative constraints limit the adoption of more granular alternatives. A training session for new postal employees in the present day emphasizes memorizing zip code prefixes to understand regional routing. Trainees learn procedural rules, rather than the historical rationale behind the system's design. The continued use of the code does not require comprehensive understanding. Adherence to standardized procedures ensures operational consistency. Over time, this procedural reliance reduces the need for explanation, allowing the system to persist as a stable convention. A contemporary online checkout form automatically fills city and state fields based on a zip code entry. The interface treats the code as the authoritative source of geographic truth. Users rarely question discrepancies, accepting the system's interpretation as default. Institutional trust in standardized classification shapes everyday interactions with digital systems, reinforcing the zip code's role as a foundational reference. A national address database maintained by the United States Postal Service continues to update zip code boundaries to reflect delivery routes, rather than political borders. The adjustments prioritize operational efficiency over geographic coherence. Despite these changes, the 5-digit code remains recognizable and stable to the public. Institutional management allows the system to evolve internally, while preserving its external appearance of permanence. A modern data visualization of the United States, composed entirely of zip code polygons, reveals a fragmented mosaic rather than a coherent map. The visualization underscores that zip codes are not geographic truths, but administrative constructs shaped by logistical needs. Yet their widespread adoption across government, business, and daily life has stabilized their meaning, making them function as a de facto geography. A routine piece of mail delivered to a suburban home today still bears a 5-digit code introduced 6 decades ago. The code persists not because it perfectly represents location, but because institutional systems from postal logistics to digital databases continue to rely on its standardized structure. Stability arises not from optimal design, but from the layered dependencies that have accumulated around it. Through these institutional decisions, standardization processes, and systems of management, the zip code has become a default spatial reference in the United States. Its endurance reflects compatibility, administrative inertia, and procedural adherence rather than geographic precision. The code continues to function as it does today, because the structures built around it make alternatives costly, ensuring that a logistical numbering system remains embedded in the fabric of everyday life.